Good morning, everyone. My name is Mel Hartley, and I am one of the team here at the Training Accreditation Council, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on clustering units. This is one of our new format chat with TAC webinars, where we will start off with a presentation, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll be using Mentimeter to capture your questions, but more on that later in the presentation. At the moment, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. Now, I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our presenter for today. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Mel, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. I can see lots of familiar names on that list, and I know some of you are joining us here in WA and others are joining from around Australia, so welcome. As Mel mentioned, our session today is about clustering units, and it's a topic that over the many years that I've been working in the vet sector is something we always get asked questions about. So today our aim is to talk about some of those fundamental things and to point you to more information where we don't have time to address those things today. So we have this session divided into two parts, really. The first part is 15 minutes where we're going to talk about the topics that you see on the screen there in front of you. So we will have a look at the fundamentals of clustering units, what the benefits are for RTOs and learners when we do that, how to cluster units, and we've got a couple of practical examples that we're going to work through with you, the kinds of challenges that you might face when you are clustering units of competency, and where you can find some more information. So your questions, as Mel mentioned, we want you to pop them into Mentimeter. We've already had a few questions come through, and we have used those questions to help us design this session as well. So any additional questions, we would love to have you pop them in Mentimeter, and you can see the Mentimeter code there, and we will get to your questions at the end of the session. So when we think about clustering is a process that's really used when you are developing training and assessment materials. And rather than developing materials for an individual unit of competency, you're developing them for a group of units of competency, which we call a cluster. And there's lots of reasons why we might do that. And the main reasons are the ones that are sitting on the screen in front of you. So where we might actually need to meet the competency profile of a learner to reflect the workplace in the learning, sometimes our units of competency are written in a way that they by themselves don't really represent a workplace task. It's not until you group them together that you actually see a full workplace task. So we certainly do that. We maximise the opportunities that we might have to actually get holistic evidence in the assessment process, and we're going to talk a little bit about holistic evidence in a minute. We do still have units in our training packages where there are co-requisite requirements, and so that is where the training package developers are telling us that we have to assess these units together. So we might cluster to meet that requirement, and probably the reason that we most often hear is that it's about maximising the efficiency for both the RTO and the learner, the effort that they have to put in, because when we cluster units of competency together, most often what we do is we're picking up on repetition that exists between those units. And so when we do that, of course, it lessens the burden on us as the RTO and on the learner. So I mentioned in there at that third dot point that opportunity for holistic evidence. And, you know, when we think about the assessment process, we collect evidence and then we make a judgment about whether someone is competent or not in a unit. And generally what happens is that our confidence in that judgment increases when we have holistic evidence. So rather than having like all the little bits and pieces of evidence that we then try and string together, when we have a holistic evidence, we are seeing someone perform a workplace task in a holistic way, and we are more confident that they can actually do that task. So what we find is that holistic evidence tends to be more representative of the types of jobs that you would see somebody performing in the workplace. And so it's not only confidence for us, it's confidence for the employers and industry as well, that someone can actually do the work activities that they're supposed to be able to do. So holistic evidence also provides the assessor with the opportunity to really see those foundations performed in the context of as well. So there are many, many benefits of actually using this type of evidence. Now, when we go to the next slide, what you'll see there is a question that we have for you. So when you think about clustering for your RTO or for the learners that are enrolled with your RTO, what do you think the benefits are for those people? Now, Mel will swap to the Mentimeter screen when you start popping in your responses. And you can see the code there. So if you go to menti.com and put that code in, it will take you to this screen. You will see that question, and we want you to pop your answers in. What are the benefits of clustering for RTOs and learners? Okay, so we're starting to see our responses there. I've got 17 responses on the screen in front of me, and there's some commonalities between the things that you are saying there. So a big one that's popping up in there is this reduction or stopping of repetition in the units, and some training packages are much better than others at repeating things throughout units. So that is a huge benefit, and of course what that can do is, as that first one has put in, it can shorten the duration of the course because it takes out all of that duplication, and for some learners that duplication makes it actually quite hard to stay motivated and engaged in the learning process. So there's a whole lot of benefits around effective use of time and resources, reduction of training time requirements, redundancies in assessment items if they're overlapping or similar. So there's a whole lot of stuff in there that you have put down that's actually around efficient and effective use of what it is you're doing. Less burden for the learners, yes. Sometimes you can have one assessment that can contribute to a judgment in many units, yes. So I think when we have a look at that, we're all on the same page about the benefits of clustering for our learners. So what we need to do is actually to then think about, if this is such a beneficial activity for us to undertake, how do we make sure that we do it well? So what you have in front of you on the screen is an example that's been drawn from the Business Services Training Package, the BSB Training Package. And what you have got in the left-hand column is part of the knowledge evidence requirements for 4 units of competency that sit in a qualification about quality auditing. With being from RTOs, you will have all experienced an audit before, and the 3 units that you see, the 511, 512 and 513 units, really represent how an audit would happen. Those units are about initiating an audit, conducting an audit and reporting on an audit. And so they sit nicely together as units that represent a holistic job role. Typically, they're done by one person, but sometimes there are other people involved in audits. And that's where the 411 unit comes in. That unit is about participating in a quality audit. And typically the things that are done there are done by a co-auditor, someone who is actually helping the lead auditor who's responsible for the other three. Now, the crosses that you can see that are bolded and underlined are where the words in the knowledge evidence are absolutely identical between the units. So if we looked at that first row, for example, auditing codes of practice and ethics appears in both the 411 unit and the 511 unit, and the wording is identical. The crosses that you can see that are small, they are where in those units some of that same information is required across the units. So, for example, on the 5th row down, quality auditing principles, techniques and systems, the 3, 511, 512, 513 have exactly the same wording in them, but the 411 unit only includes part of that. So it actually includes quality auditing techniques, but not principles and systems. So when you look at that pattern of crosses overall, we can see that in fact there's quite a lot of overlap between the knowledge evidence for that unit. And so these units might be candidates for us to cluster for delivery and assessment. So obviously, we don't just consider the knowledge evidence in a unit, we have to consider the full unit. And what you're seeing here is where I've gone back to the remainder of the unit. So I've looked at the elements and performance criteria and the performance evidence, and I've asked myself the question, I had that knowledge evidence, would it be required to actually do these tasks? So the crosses in black are where that knowledge evidence would be required to do the task in the rest of the unit. And the crosses in green are where, even though that's not listed in the unit, you would definitely need to know that to be able to actually do the task that's in the unit. So again, like when you have compared the rest of the content of these units of competency, these are definitely a group of units that we should consider for clustering. So if we thought about this from a learning perspective, it might look something like this. So the orange circle that you can see at the bottom is where we have the common knowledge and skill that is actually in those units of competency. The bubbles that you see around it, the grey, blue and pink bubbles, are where you would then build on that common knowledge and skill with specialised knowledge and skill that's relevant to particular tasks and the units. So when you see that pattern, it becomes clear that we have this core set of common knowledge and skill, and that we have some parts of those units that have specialised knowledge and skill. But again, it makes sense when you look at how that would flow for them to be grouped together. So if you had got to the point where you had a model like this, this is then something that you could take to your industry people, your industry engagement partners, and say, does this make sense? Would it work for you? This is another example that has come out of the RII training package, and this is for 2 units of competency machines that you might operate in that sector. One of them is a skid steer loader, and one of them is a wheeled front end loader. Now, when you have a look at and this is the knowledge evidence, you can see that the words that are being used in the knowledge evidence are identical. So on the surface, it looks like the degree of overlap between these units is really substantial. When you look more closely, What you might find though is that some of the things that are in there might in fact be different, even though the word is the same. So the ones that you see in green boxes there are things that would sit across both units. So signs of fatigue and how you manage fatigue, as an example, is something that would be common irrespective of the kind of machine that you are operating on. However, things like isolation procedures in a machine, they might be different in different machines. So even though it looks like they are identical, you would need to do a bit more investigation to find out if in fact those things are common and they could be grouped together. As an RTO, what you're going to have to do is figure out, do this analysis of your units and figure out if it's right to actually cluster them. And we have a bit of a checklist to help you do that, and this has been provided to you as a handout. So this is a set of questions that you might like to consider to say, yes, it's a good idea to cluster, no, it's not, or maybe we've got to do a little bit more digging to figure out if this is right. Now, we can answer yes or answer no, and neither of those things actually mean we would cluster or not, but it does mean we have to consider the implications of those things for clustering. So if we looked at an example from that checklist, so one of the questions on that checklist is, are the units at the same Australian Qualifications Framework level? And in our example that we used with the auditing, one of them is sitting at, or would be expected from, a Certificate 4 level qualification, and 3 of them are units that you would expect to find in a diploma level qualification. So when we think about this at an implication, in an implications type frame, what we find is that in fact they may have quite different requirements, and a really common thing would be something like communication skills. So communication skills, those same words are used in units at different AQF levels, but what you will find is that when you're looking at communication skills in maybe a Certificate 2 or a Certificate 3, it might be around you, for example, communicating with your colleagues, following instructions, being able to read instructions, maybe sending memos. Once you start to move up the AQF level, when you find those words in qualifications that maybe sit at diploma or advanced diploma, it might be more around skills that you would then use to influence other people. It might be using your communication skills to resolve conflict. So even though the words say the same thing, the nature of where the unit sits within the qualifications framework may mean that there are different requirements. And the result of that is, like, sometimes the evidence that we might say we want to use this across both units actually can't be used across both units. So the point of that checklist is to help you consider the things that might be important for you to make a decision about whether you would cluster or not. We'll just summarise this before we get to your questions. Clustering is a really valuable tool that you can use within your RTOs, and it can be used for both delivery and assessment. There are many, many benefits for RTOs, for the learners, and for the workplace, but you have to consider it really carefully. And there's a lot that you need to do in terms of planning and preparation. And it's a little bit of that pain up front to get all the benefit a little bit later for both you and for the students that are in your RTO. There are a number of resources that are available to you that can provide you with some more information around clustering. Standards for RTOs and the User's Guide. There's a DTWD publication that you can download, Assessment in the Vet Sector, and that publication has an entire chapter on clustering, and some of the information that we've used today comes from that document. And you've also got the webinar handout that we gave you today, that checklist that you can use, that you could adapt and use in your RTO. Okay, so I've managed to talk for quite some time, and now it's your turn to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away. Okay. Practical logistics of organising teaching and assessment materials for clustered units. Well, I think probably up front, the big thing would be the time that it takes in planning and designing these materials, because you're not just considering what you have to do over one unit, you're considering how it fits across many. So there is definitely more effort involved in that design. And of course, often those materials tend to be a little more substantial than a student might be used to in comparison to a single unit of competency. So you would certainly need to work with the students to help them understand how to actually use the materials and understand that those materials actually sit across many units rather than just one. I think when you're doing this clustering, quite often in organisations, individual trainers and assessors will handle units. So if you can get people who typically deliver and assess those units to work together as a team for design, you would get a better outcome because, of course, you'll have the collective wisdom of that group. And then the other thing that you have to be really clear about is, even though, as we mentioned earlier, assessment is gathering evidence and making a judgment, your evidence gathering is happening over the cluster, but your judgment about competency still happens at an individual level. So there needs to be a way for you to be able to unpick that evidence and be able to clearly allocate it to a unit to make the judgment about the individual unit. So I hope I've answered your question there. Okay, number 2. Clustering assessment to benefit the work. What are the pitfalls? Okay. Well, I don't think there's too many, to be honest. But that one thing that I just mentioned then about being able to unpick the evidence or allocate that evidence to the unit of competency, then this is something you really have to manage well. Sometimes what you will find is that students might be able to meet the requirements for 2 or 3 units in the cluster, but not all of them. So that unpicking is really something you have to manage very well. The other thing is, sometimes for the student cohort, clustering doesn't work for particular cohorts. A very typical one of that is part-time students. It doesn't work well for part-time students, and also sometimes RTOs where they have very set timetables. So where VET is delivered in schools, or where the TAGs work on terms and semesters, sometimes when you get bigger clusters in there, it can be very hard to actually achieve everything in the cluster in the time frame that you have. This is a nice question. So when we're talking about nominal hours, we're talking about what the government determines is available for you to do delivery and assessment. So there will still be a guide, but typically what we find within RTOs is that you will manipulate those nominal hours to suit the client group anyway. That is what our regulatory standard requires you to do. So you would still use them as a guide, but observe, I don't know that I would use the word observe for that. Use them as a guide, but you've got to adjust to meet your client group. Very good question. So prerequisite units have to be assessed before the assessment for the other unit happens. So you could absolutely cluster for delivery. When it comes to the assessment, you would have to assess the prerequisite unit before you assessed the unit that it was a prerequisite for. One of the things that you can consider would be how you can use, we've already talked about it a couple of times, where you have a process of collecting evidence, then using it to make a judgment. You might find that in the relationship between those units, there's some evidence that can be shared, but the decision about competence for the prerequisite unit has to be made first. Another good question. So, and I'm going to have to make an assumption about what you are meaning by combining units, but and how I'm going to interpret that is sometimes RTOs will put units of competency together. They're not clustered, they're still taught as individual units and assessed as individual units, but they just sit in a stream. So I think the real difference between what I think those two terms mean is clustering where there is a real integration of the delivery and possibly the assessment, so one or other or both of those things, whereas combining is just like putting them together like carriages on a train. Another good question. Well, so what we need to think about there is, I guess, our unit of currency. Like the smallest part of our unit of currency in the vet sector is a full unit. And so you might find that you have some common parts of it that you use or that sit across different units. But that assessment has got to be against the full unit of competency. So you might find you have some common knowledge that you teach, you might have some common evidence that you use across multiple units, but remember that we always talk about things as a full unit of competency. And in our regulation, it is about how you as an RTO address the full unit and how you as an RTO make an assessment judgment against a full unit of competency. Yes, that was an easy question. Yes, so we can collect evidence against a cluster, but we make the judgment against the individual unit of competency always. Okay, this is a good question. And the reason I think it's a really good question is because often figuring out the evidence that you require for an individual unit, in fact, then makes it easier to figure out how you might be able to group those units together, because ultimately we always have to come back to making the assessment judgment against the individual unit of competency. So I actually think you could do it both ways. You could start, and often the introduction of a new qualification is an opportunity to do this. You could start thinking about it from a cluster from the get-go, or you could go back and have a look at the previous assessments for the individual units and say, well, this is how we could actually combine these together to make a cluster. So that almost feels like a politician's answer to that one, but it is, yeah, you could do that both ways. Yes, it could. It could. So, when you have international students, there are, lots of other requirements that sit around things you have to put in place for international students, and there are set hours that have to be put in place. So it absolutely could affect the duration of study for those providers, yes. Okay. So thank you so much for joining us today. What you've got on the screen in front of you is some information we'd like to share with you. Firstly, tax contact details and asking you for your feedback. So there's a link to a SurveyMonkey feedback. If you think there's ways we could do these workshops better, or you would like to provide other feedback to TAC, please use that link, because we would love your feedback. You can also follow TAC on a number of different social platforms, and you can see all the links to those platforms there. And Mel also has a link to our professional development calendar, which tells you all of the upcoming events that we have running for the rest of this year, which is rapidly disappearing. So thank you again for coming today. I hope you have some information that is helpful for you, and please refer back to the other sources of information if you would like some more detail around clustering units of competency. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.